Mark, welcome to Disabled and Proud. How are you today?
Fine. I'm melting. We're talking during a bit of a, well, it's all relative in the UK, isn't it? But a bit of a heat wave, and I suffer during that. But I could be worse.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually so nice to have the sun out, isn't it? Even if it's super warm, it's just nice to have everything light and like the nights are longer. I love the summer.
Yeah. We'll get on to my condition, but actually, I like spring and autumn. I can't be too cold. I can't be too hot.
Somewhere in the middle.
But yeah, it looks nice out there.
For sure. So I'm going to ask you my first question, and that is,
Ah,
how do you refer to your disability?
pain in the ass. Or multiple sclerosis, or and it's not a technical way of describing it, but advanced multiple sclerosis.
Now, I actually don't know that much about multiple sclerosis. And from like my knowledge of it, which is incredibly limited, I thought it was muscle wastage, but that's wrong, isn't it?
It's the nerves that mess up. So it's always an icky thought, but it's your brain and your spinal cord. And in MS's case, it's the protective sheath around the nerves that's affected. And because it's the nerves, they go bloody everywhere. And you can therefore get a million approximately different symptoms, all of which advance and sort of appear at different times and not at all and heavily and forever and whatever. So your muscles waste because the nerves aren't telling them what to do rather than wastage. But yes, wastage can be a result.
Yeah. So does that mean, and for me, I always think nerve endings and pain, or that's where you like your senses you can feel. Does that mean that for you can feel pain more intensely? How does that side of it work?
Oh my word. So in that specific symptom, I can't feel temperature much, either way, hot or cold, which is kind of fine, except during the time when we were bathing our children. I couldn't tell the temperature of a bath.
Oh wow.
So that was a pain.
Yeah.
Separate to that, because my nerves are essentially buggered, another technical term, I get intense nerve pain, which is currently under control with drugs, and I can just feel it creeping back at night time at the moment, but it's bearable. So nerve pain is different to feeling pain externally.
Yeah. I find this fascinating because I think autoimmune, like as a conversation, is incredibly interesting because I find like the way the body works fascinating. And so when we talk about disability, and obviously I have a very physical disability, so I don't experience the same symptoms that you will. And so I always find it incredibly interesting talking about these things because how we now experience and navigate the world are going to be completely different, even though we're both under this umbrella term of disability. And I usually go on to talk to people about childhood, but I've read your website, which says, my childhood was lovely. I had a great time.
Yes.
And so I was wondering, actually, if we could talk about your diagnosis and how that all came about, because I think this is a very interesting topic of conversation because MS, autoimmune. So does that mean it was there all the time, or is it something that comes on with time? How does this all work? Because I'm actually very clueless in this topic.
No, that's fine. So, well, firstly, 83% of disabled people, that was the latest stat I read, become disabled. So you're born believing you're immortal, and at some point you're not quite as immortal as you thought. But MS is typically diagnosed between the ages of 20 and 40. So it's a young person's disease, although it's sometimes perceived as an older person's disease because it's progressive and therefore it emerges later and becomes more apparent later, and walking stick and walker, wheelchair, which I'm in, and I've got a suprapubic catheter, which is a tube coming out of my tummy that I can wee out of. So I've got a messy version of MS, but autoimmune, they don't even understand MS yet, even though it's a very common disease. There's about 130,000 people with MS in the UK. But roughly speaking, the current theory is you're born prone to it. So it can be slightly in the family. It wasn't in mine, although I had a grandfather with diabetes type 1, which is also more autoimmune. So you're born with the DNA, the chromosomes that make you more likely to catch it. There's vitamin D deficiency, which means it's very common in away from the equator. So if you want to get MS, go and live in Canada or Scotland, preferably when you're young. And then a trigger, and they're not quite sure about it, but the current theory is Epstein-Barr virus, which is a very common virus. I think 95% of us get it. That can lead to glandular fever, or it can lead to nothing. But that may well be the trigger. But despite many years of research, they don't actually know. But that's kind of the lead into it.
Yeah, that's the kind of like the general pattern as such, even though it's still not as well researched as it, as it should be, which is fascinating, really, isn't it? Because I love this, because my brain's going like 100 miles an hour, because it's so interesting that this can happen, right? So I don't know, for me, I always thought that autoimmune was always like underlying, and then it kind of appears and rears its ugly head at any point in time. But actually, that's not necessarily the truth. Something can trigger something else, which in turn causes some form of reaction, and that's what you come out with, which I think is so interesting, because people often think, always, I'm going to say, and quite boldly always, is that there has to be some form of tragic event, tragic accident, tragic something that happens that means that you acquire your disability, when actually that's not necessarily the case. And I love that, because it's kind of showing the world that actually, like, your preconceptions around disability are wrong.
Well, how many preconceptions about disability are wrong? But yes, there's one to add to the list.
Yeah, exactly. And so what was it like for you getting your diagnosis, and what led you to go and get a diagnosis?
MS creeps up on you. Well, for a lot of people, it creeps up on you. One of the few symptoms that I haven't yet collected, and maybe I never will, is optic neuritis, as in eyes going foggy, all sorts of spots on your eyes, whatever. I've got middle-aged glasses on. That's it. I know I look 21, but actually I'm a little bit older than that. But for me, there were a number of symptoms that I ignored. So the first one was an intense round of pins and needles all down my left-hand side for 3 days.
Oh, wow.
I was 1992, and I know it was 1992 because I was working at the opening of Euro Disney, now Disneyland Paris.
Yeah.
And I was living in France, and I was like I said, an immortal bloke. I was 23 or 24. So I ignored it, and it went away. And I carried on with having the best time of my life at Disney.
Yeah.
A couple of years later, dodgy bladder. I blamed that on too much wine and too much coffee. And in the 90s in France, you could pretty much pee anywhere anyway. So I visited many a gatepost and tree and whatever, and had the odd accident, but ignored that and thought it was some kind of secret sect of men that had the odd accident but never talked about it.
Yeah.
And a couple of times in the next few years, I was running through treacle, and I thought that was being unfit, but that's a very different sensation. Your legs just aren't obeying. And erectile dysfunction.
Mm-hmm.
And funnily enough, I went to the doctor about erectile dysfunction. um, uh, so, and at that point, the blue pill was just coming on the market,
Mm-hmm.
but at the time to test, I had to have an injection into my willy, which was and I drove into Paris to get it done. And even as I walked out of the, I'm sorry, I'm going to be a little bit crude in this bit of the conversation, but I even as I walked out of the room, I was getting a stiffy the size of my gear stick of my car. And I drove home, which was about an hour. And by the time I got home, I was in agony from an hour of an erection that,
Yeah.
not being careful which gear stick I reached for.
Yeah.
And I had to call the doctor and say, I can't, this is too bad. It hurts too much.
Yeah.
And so I had to drive back into the doctors and the specialists and have a cannula into my willy to take some blood off.
Wow.
And he said, so it's all in your head, isn't it? Which, of course, it was in a sense. But I then put that down to, the guilt, either the alcohol or the guilt of being a floozy, because I was, or whatever. And again, I didn't put that together. So blue pill took the romance out of many of my liaisons, but, if you waited an hour, we could have some fun. So all those ones I parked. I met my wife 1999, so 7 years after my first symptoms, the pins and needles. And it wasn't until, and we married that same year because we loved each other and we still do. And it wasn't until 2007 I was diagnosed. And the cause of that, we'd had our first son. And in the morning, my wife had noticed a couple of things, but in the morning, after a night feed that I got up, I told my wife I couldn't stand up for a moment, and I know it was my turn, and I did it, but I just couldn't get up. And she said, look, we need to go to the doctor. And I was sent to a neurologist, which is a brain specialist, and a urologist, which is a down below waterworks specialist. And between them, I got a relatively quick diagnosis, albeit 15 years late, of MS. You go for an MRI, they stick pins all over your feet to see what your sensations are. They check your balance with your eyes closed. They do the touch your nose stuff. They do some test of your eyes reactions to dots on the screen. But it was about a 3-month process, which is relatively fast for an actual diagnosis.
Yeah. And that, in and of itself, the fact that you ignored symptoms, but you didn't necessarily know that they were symptoms is, again, and it just goes to show that if I had those symptoms, I would also have done the same because my knowledge of MS is so limited. And that blows my mind because how many people are now walking about with said symptoms, and actually it's the marker actually of something starting that you could actually, I don't know if you can help prevent it getting progressive or not, but you at least have a diagnosis of what's going on, and you would know what's going on as well, because I'm sure at some points you were a bit like, what the hell is going on with my body? Like, why do these things seem to be happening?
I was so ignorant and happy, enjoying my life, that I didn't. The stupid thing is those pins and needles were the only one that really struck me, and I thought I'd had a minor stroke, which of course you should go straight to the doctor. But that was literally the only one. I thought the others were
just like a part of life.
I didn't link them up at all.
Wow. And then what's it, 15 years after your first symptom?
Yeah.
Wow. Like,
That's long-ish, but not the longest I've heard.
yeah, well, I can imagine, because particularly I think around like autoimmune, and in my head I'm thinking particularly of EDS, because I know a lot of people who have got EDS and how long it takes for EDS to be diagnosed. Because we don't necessarily know much about these things, doctors do like to say it's all in your head, you're faking it, and you yourself experience that.
Yes.
And I just think, how wild is it that we've got to a point where doctors can turn around and you can hand them symptoms and they can be like, it's all made up. Like,
Yeah.
you're not experiencing that. That doesn't exist. Like,
I know it's crazy though. You know, I'm a kind of no regrets person, and sorry, I just lost my train of thought. One of the other symptoms of MS is cog fog. So my brain is a muscle, and is controlled by nerves. So I suffer from extreme fatigue and short-term memory loss, and just a messy brain. So remind me what we were talking about. Sorry.
You were saying that you were a no regrets kind of person, and I was talking about how doctors can just kind of fob you off.
Yes, I remember now. Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm a public speaker. That's what I make money out of now. It's awful when I go, I've got 3 points to make. Now, 1, 2, oh, what was the third? I can't remember. Anyway, no, the no regrets thing is, I don't regret that 15 years of not being diagnosed, because at the time there was little or nothing to be done for MS. So, you know, I lived on in happy ignorance. But nowadays, it's there's so many treatments and ways to deal with MS that nowadays I'd have wanted a quick diagnosis.
Yeah. And actually, let's talk about your career as you got diagnosed with MS, because I think it's always really interesting how disability can impact, or like on the other hand, can completely not impact your career, and if it changes, how it changes. And also, I think a lot of people do end up changing what they do when they do get a diagnosis of some form of disability. And what was that like for you?
I am so lucky. I've had this amazing life and career. I intend to carry on, but I have had a wonderful time. So I had 10 years at Disney, all of them ill, but just amazing. Theme park, Walt Disney TV, and Walt Disney Company corporate. So it was just wonderful. And my wife worked for Disney, and she worked for the stores and everything else. I had some time working for David Lloyd Leisure, which is the health and fitness gang. I did triathlons. In retrospect, they were pretty tough with my MS, undiagnosed. But I had recently joined Dixon's when which is now Curry's PLC. So the stores that were Curry's PC World, Dixon's Travel, and then we merged with Carphone Warehouse to become Dixon's Carphone, which after I left became Curry's PLC. But at the time, I was the most senior comms person for the company, not for the soft, fun PR stuff, getting nonsense in the paper. It was about results and working with your CEO and crisis management and stuff like that. And when I was diagnosed, I kind of point to 3 things that were just amazing. So when I was diagnosed, I flipped and I went straight. I didn't know what MS was. I confused it with MND, the one that you know, just it's got, you've got Rob Burrows at the moment in the rugby league player who Kevin Sinfield's been running the marathons for, and with ME is the fatigue illness.
Yeah.
I thought maybe it was that. I just didn't know. So I went to Dr. Google, and it was just, I decided I had about 10 minutes to live, because of course on Google you find all the worst case
Yeah.
scenarios. So I took 2 weeks away from work. And while I was away, all my team got together and did some research into MS, about what was MS, and also what I would be experiencing and going through, and and everything else. So the magic of when I went back was just that everybody was approachable and normal with me.
Yeah.
Now, I talk about it often, but when you are diagnosed with a nasty disease, just as if you are, with a disability, just as if you are diagnosed with cancer, or you have a stillborn baby, or just something really traumatic, you lose friends.
Yeah.
Not because, a tiny percent of them might be nasty, but most of them just don't know what to say.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know how to approach you, so they ignore you. And this isn't COVID, by the way. I checked. It's okay. We can still kiss.
I can't wait.
Oh, jolly good. I'll just have to get my wife's permission. Sorry, lost track again. Oh my word.
Talking about when you moved to Dixon's, and you're saying the people who were
they were just so supportive, and not one of them sort of treated me differently, or treated me less, or anything else, and that was wonderful. So that was experience number one. At that point, I was probably verging on the what we call walking drunk in terms of disability. I then went through, and I didn't have to change roles at the time, but I then went on. I can remember my first day walking in with a walking stick.
Yeah.
Then crutches, and a walker, and eventually a wheelchair.
Yeah.
But if I roll back to the walking stick stage, at some point I was called in by my boss, who was on the exec board of a big company, and my HR director. And what I feared was either the guilty check, as in, you're not coping, have 10 grand, off you go into the sunset, there, Mark, or being made chief photocopier.
Yeah.
To put me in the corner and keep me employed. And what they did was magical. They said, roughly speaking, Mark, we love what you do. You haven't let us down yet, but you're going to start to struggle. What role would you like to do that will help us as a business and will help you keep going? Wow. And that was like, wow. And at the time, Twitter was emerging as a real power. And as was all social media, but Twitter particularly in the business sphere. And we decided on, and I'd been talking to the same journalist who I used to get drunk in London with, and see every quarter for the results and for crises and whatever. And I suggested head of corporate social media. So again, not retweet to win a washing machine, but working with my CEO to get him noticed on Twitter, working with the corporate team, and my replacement, who joined partly because she saw how well they looked after me. So I did that, and the magic of that was, one, in business terms, we turned my CEO, who's now the FTSE 100. So he became the most followed FTSE 100 Twitterer, on the FTSE 100. Wow. So, and that was me nagging him. I never wrote for him. We let it be his authentic words. So he gained a following. I gained a business and a journalist following and a fan base of Dixon's people. And the corporate side would often be printed in newspapers, you know, as a little headline, as a little thing. And I had tweets printed, my CEO had tweets printed, and the corporate Dixon's Carphone PLC had tweets printed. So that was just wonderful for the business.
Yeah.
And for me, I could start to remote work before it was a thing.
Before it became fashionable.
I could tweet from bed. I could whatever. I could just keep functioning. So that was magical bit number 2.
Yeah.
And then magical bit number 3 was a few years later. We had moved from Hemel Hempstead, which I'm very near to. I live on the Dunstable Downs, right near to Whipsnade Zoo. I'm pointing over there as if you can see the lions, and I can't see the lions either. But on a good day, I can hear the lions and the chimps and the elephants, which is very weird for Bedfordshire.
Yeah.
But we had moved after the merger to Acton, which was a long commute. And it was getting harder. And even though I had moved, by the way, when I changed jobs, I moved to a 4-day week, even though I was still paid 5 days, which was the other thing that they gave me. Amazing. And I went to them and said, look, I can't cope. I need to go. And without any kind of negotiation, they gave me a big payoff.
Yeah.
And again, they didn't need to. There was no redundancy at the time. There was nothing. They were just lovely. So I've got no shares, no involvement, no attachment to Dixon's. Most of the people who worked for them then have moved on because it was 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And I'm still, you can hear me talking about them proudly. I still retweet results, still talk to the journalists because they treated me well. I was incredibly grateful, but that should be the norm.
Yeah. And also what I think is really poignant actually is that you're one of the very few people I know who've been treated well by their employers when a diagnosis has been given. But equally, in saying that, I think they did that because they probably just loved you as who you were, regardless of what had gone on. And I think actually that's a really lovely thing. Like, your team went away and researched your diagnosis to support you. And not many people get that, like, regardless of where they work and regardless of who they work with. And I think that's actually such a marker of who you are as a person, because they've wanted to support you. And that in itself has like made my heart really warm. And I'm like, that's like the loveliest thing ever.
Well, it is, but it's why you campaign, why I campaign. It's just, it wasn't particularly difficult for the company to do that. And, they've got this free of charge ambassador forever.
Yeah.
So it was a win-win. And that's what's so hard to communicate to businesses. The purple pound, how much we've got to spend and how much we will decline to spend if something is inaccessible, whatever inaccessible means to us, digitally or a ramp or whatever. And it's just a win-win to look after disabled people as people.
Yeah. And I would actually love to talk to you about how you then transition from working at Dixon's to then going into what you do now. Because the reason I found you is through LinkedIn and through a lot of other people who've been like, talk to Mark, talk to Mark, talk to Mark. And I was like, okay, who is Mark?
So actually, I'll one last thing about Dixon's. When I left, I wrote a LinkedIn piece listing those 3 things, and I did it very succinctly. And I'm not saying I'm the first person who wrote the standard, I've been so proud to work at X, but it did feel relatively early on in that, everybody writes that now. But I wrote that. and it went viral, and it got 875,000 views. It was bonkers. And I was offered a job, a couple of jobs. So some advisory work for an SEO company. I still don't understand SEO, but I don't know. I did it. I got some shares, and I got approached by Shift.ms, which is a charity that works for it's a social network for MSers, people with MS. And there's 50,000 worldwide. I did 1 day a week and set up their PR, got some nice coverage, and started talking and just accepting my disability. I can remember the time I went into a Costa. This is still back to Dixon's days, but I went into a local Costa, and I was starting to be, like I said, walking drunk. And I said, I'm partially disabled. Would you mind bringing my coffee over? Because I couldn't quite say disabled. So I came to this sort of gradual acceptance of disability, which I clearly now fully embrace. And I talked on LinkedIn. I already had some speaking engagements through my Dixons and then Shift.ms, and I turned it into a skill. And I just waffle away on LinkedIn. I tweet a little. I tweet less than I did, but I've got a good following there. I find it a little bit of an angry place now, and I just tout around for business and speaking.
Yeah, I think it's really important what you said about your journey to accepting disability, because obviously you now fully embrace it, and your positivity posts of the day are always like a highlight for me to read on LinkedIn. It is a journey for everyone, and I think we need to kind of to push that a bit more, because I think people think that you just wake up and suddenly you're like, yay, like I'm disabled, woohoo, like I've done it, I'm accepted it. And actually it's a lot deeper than that, because it is definitely a journey for everyone, and everybody's journey is wildly different. Nobody has the same journey as anybody else when it comes to embracing it. And for you, what was it like coming to that embrace? Did you find it hard, or was it relatively easy?
Yeah, I can't really separate it from the grief process that I went through from diagnosis. So grief with MS is kind of ongoing, because every so often you develop a new horrible symptom. So you or you just progress. So the wheelchair comes out and you dip back into grief and shame and whatever else you feel. I never went through the anger bit. I just accepted it. But in terms of, I don't know when I suddenly decided to look, sod it, let's make a career out of public speaking, and let's be proud to be disabled. But it was years. It was absolutely, it was a good few years. And like I said, there was a small phase where I was partially disabled, which is pretty ridiculous. But I guess I was disabled from the first day of those pins and needles, technically. But that was 20 years before I probably said I'm disabled.
Yeah. But again, like, that's so important to share, because it is, everybody has a completely different journey, and it's not smooth. But we would all love and wish and want it to be like the easiest journey in the world, to be like, oh my gosh, done, accepted, cool, in the room. But we don't, it's not like that. And partially that's society's fault, because of how society views disability. But I think it's so important to share that everybody has some form of journey with acceptance to disability. But once you accept it, oh my God, life becomes so different. And once you accept that you're part of the disabled community, and then, even if you just chat with other disabled people, we're like the most welcoming people I've ever met in my life, factually.
Yes, and actually, some of the things that have come out of being disabled, whether that's accepting it or whatever, that I've found nicer things about myself. I've become more empathetic.
Yeah.
I've met amazing people. I've had amazing adventures, and disability is a huge part of me. But it's a community that is very disparate, and that's another reason I campaign so hard.
Mm-hmm.
It is to have people become proud of being disabled, but also just to accept they're disabled.
Yeah.
And that they are the largest minority. You know, it's an eternal argument in the diversity argument. There's always about, well, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, and below that are the three other ones that, you know, it's social mobility, age, and disability.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they're all really important, diverse minorities and judged against struggling communities, but they're always forgotten, or often forgotten.
I want to talk about your hair. So for those who can't see, Mark is currently wearing a blue Mohican.
Yes.
So I'm all for, and I just love to explain a bit more about it.
Well, I don't know about you, but I resent being stared at because of my wheelchair.
Uh-huh.
So I decided to have. I totally embrace middle age. I've got no worries about my age. So I've had no midlife crisis, but I decided to have a midlife crisis and wear silly clothes and do silly things with my hair as a way of saying, what are you looking at? Are you looking at a middle-aged man wearing silly clothes, or are you looking at my wheelchair?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just that. So I have fun. My poor wife despairs. My children laugh. And Amazon does well out of cheap nonsense clothing. So that's it. It's, what are you staring at? What do you want to ask me? Talk to me.
Yeah.
Don't those rude stares. I'm not an angry person, but that's an area that I really struggle with.
Mm-hmm.
But just those sideways glances where they don't think you've noticed. Or a couple of years ago, I was out on the Dunstable Downs on a snowy day, and my funky wheelchair, which is a very funky motorized wheelchair, flipped over in the snow, and everybody, it was during lockdown, so we were out in the open, but everybody was skirting around each other.
Of everyone.
Lots of people were coming in to offer to help, and luckily my 15-year-old son could help me out. And I saw someone filming me, and I just shouted at him, and I know he was doing it for TikTok or to show his friends, or for laughs and giggles, and I just thought, you shit.
Yeah.
So I wear silly clothes. I've got multiple colors of Mohican to wear. Purple is one that'll come out for a couple of events coming up, because that's the symbolic color of disability. It's a bit of a laugh.
Yeah. But I really love that, because I think you're right. There is staring when it's rude, and people don't know what. There is sometimes when people don't know where to look, and they try not to make eye contact because they feel so uncomfortable. But then there's this particular type of staring that makes you uncomfortable because the way they're looking at you, and it's not that they're looking at you as a person, they're looking at you as other, as an object, as something that's so different from them. And to the point where you're right, it's like it's eerily uncomfortable, and it's not a nice experience. But I love the fact that you're taking that and having these like horrible experiences and kind of flipping it on its head and being like, well, actually, fuck you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And when kids look at you, it's fine, and often it's an opportunity to educate. If it's right, I'll engage with them. Otherwise, you'll see the mum telling them off for staring or something, and you have to leave it. But I'll often engage with younger audiences, but when it's adults, they just should know better.
I'm so with you on that. Adult staring is incredibly different to children staring.
Yes.
I love kids. I think they're great. I sometimes actually know. I was about to say I sometimes wish I still had my kid brain, and then I realized that actually I do. And sometimes that can be problematic for me. But adults not knowing and staring and just encapsulating rudeness is so unnecessary, particularly in society where people educate for free, right? And particularly when all the material is out there, and also manners exist. Like, manners is just not staring. You don't need to look. I'm just doing like my daily stuff. I'm going to Sainsbury's or I'm going to the co-op. I'm picking up a pint of milk. It's really not that interesting. You don't need to look.
Yes.
As simple as it is.
Anyway, we'll campaign on.
That we will. So I like to ask if you have a piece of advice for a younger version of yourself, but also for a younger person with the same disability as you.
So, first of all, no advice for myself.
I love that.
Because like I said, there's not a lot could have been done.
Mm-hmm.
And I've led a very happy life. So, boom. I've just had so many adventures. It's, you could do a whole podcast about all the nonsensing I've done.
Mark and his nonsense.
Yeah. I don't know if you've seen on my positivity posts, I often use the word nonsensing. I should trademark it.
Yeah.
So no advice to myself, because wonderful wife, wonderful kids, 3 cats and a turtle, lovely house. So that's in terms of advice to somebody recently diagnosed, it is to immediately start looking after yourself, because the treatments are so good now that if you take the correct medications, if you eat healthily, exercise, practice mindfulness, you are, I don't know the statistics, but 90% unlikely to get like me. You can live a pretty normal life. And there's one neurologist in the US called Aaron Boster. He talks about make MS boring, as in a little bit like AIDS. It was terrifying in the 80s and 90s. And nowadays people live with it, and they're relatively fine. And we're getting there with MS. So it would just be, this is a serious disease, but you can make it boring by just doing the right stuff early on.
I love that, make it boring, because it takes every single piece of like scared or unknown or like just general worry out of it. That actually, because let's be honest, we're not really ever worried about things that are boring. Like when was the last time you were worried about something that you were like, this is boring as? Like, never. And actually taking that and flipping it so that you're making MS boring is powerful. And it's making it, like these things happen, but actually life can be lived and life goes on, and it makes, I mean, obviously it's going to make some difference, but it's not going to be this massive big thing that it was when people first started getting diagnosed with it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll say it again, I've had an amazing life. But I'd rather have not had MS. I'd rather still be working full time. But I've just had a brilliant time. But somebody diagnosed now really doesn't have to face much, touch wood, shouldn't face too much of a challenge with MS.
Yeah. I like to think that when we go through hardship, if we can notice a positive trait about ourselves, then we've learned something through that. And I was wondering if through any hardship that you've had throughout your life, is there a particular positive trait about yourself that upon reflection you're really proud of?
I don't know where my positivity comes from. I've had a really tough time The year I met my wife, we burnt our flat down in Paris. Or
Like,
it burnt down, lost everything. I lost my sister to alcoholism, and we were very close.
yeah.
I've got MS. My son was hit by a car, big time.
Oh my
He's
goodness.
fine. And yet I've always bounced back. And I don't know how to answer this.
Yes.
So I think a false smile, we know about suicidal tendencies and depression and everything else. And I've been very lucky that MS can actually be a symptom of not just because you're anxious about MS, but it can actually be a symptom because your brain is tweaked of depression.
Yeah.
I've just gone through life happy, in love, blessed with opportunities, and I can't put that down to a trait. So I was going to say, when I said about suicide, I wonder if the fact of just smiling and laughing is the background to it all.
Yeah.
Is just, look, just get on with it, Mark. You can say why me, but why not me?
Yeah. Oh, like, firstly, thank you for sharing all that information with me, because I appreciate that it's not always easy to talk about difficult things. But secondly, I love that you can't put it down to a trait, because I love to ask that question, because as human beings, we're not very good at actually looking into ourselves and pointing out good things about ourselves, or like, what we're proud of. And so for you to be like, do you know what? I think it's just who I am. That's not a particular trait, is so gorgeous, because it just encapsulates who you are as a person. And I think I read your positivity posts and I love reading them. I get a real kick out of them because sometimes they're absolutely hilarious. But also just who you are as a person. You're incredibly funny, but also when you talk about disability, you make it accessible for so many people, which sometimes it isn't accessible for everyone, because we're talking about things that, even though we're the biggest minority, not everybody can understand. And so I think that that's just you. And I love that, because there's no airs and graces. I'm just Mark.
Yes, I'm happy. I'm a bit strange. Life is good.
Yeah. I've only got one final question for you, Mark. And that is, are you disabled and proud?
What do you reckon?
I'm going to go with yes. And I think
Yes.
I'm right.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a new-ish phase in my life of campaigning and living the life of a very disabled person.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to embrace it. I am embracing it, and life is good.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on today and for sharing your story and your knowledge, and just everything that you said today. I think is so poignant in so many different ways. And I'm really thankful that you've taken the time out of your day to talk to me, because I know that, as you said, sometimes you get some cog fog, and the fact that you've decided to spend some spoons or like spend your brain power on me is really appreciated. So I really thank you for that.
Absolute pleasure. Lovely to meet you, and we can kiss later.
Oh my God, I'm so excited.
Hurrah.